My name is Jason Pandek, Vice President at AmeriVet, and today I'm joined by retired United States Marine Corps Brigadier General Michael Brogan to discuss President Biden's recent executive order on supply chains and the challenges we continue to face in 2021. Thank you for joining me today, General Brogan.
Certainly, JP. Good to talk with you again.
Yeah, it's great to hear from you again, sir, too. It's been a while since we last spoke, though. If you don't mind, can you give us a quick refresher on your background and the latest things you've been up to?
Yes. So I spent a little over 31 years on active duty in the Marine Corps, but significantly 15 of those years were spent serving as an acquisition professional involved in procurement and government contracting, buying the goods and services for the United States Marine Corps. The highlight of that was I spent almost 4 years as the commander of Marine Corps Systems Command. And during that time, I was dual-hatted as the Joint Program Executive Officer for the Mine Resistant Ambush Protected Vehicle, or MRAP, program, where we spent more than $40 billion delivering over 26,000 life-saving vehicles to U.S. service members, allies, and coalition partners.
That's amazing, sir. I was tangentially supporting that program up in TACOM in Michigan, and I just remember doing a lot of things with a lot of great people there under MRAP. But that was a lot of things that we delivered that was saving lives. And I'd like to jump into. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It was tremendously rewarding because we knew every day that what we did made a difference in the lives and limbs of U.S. service members and helped them get home to their families.
Yeah, I remember that quite well. And so again, as a personal level, I appreciate your support on that, having ridden around in some of those. But without further ado, let's dive into our discussion for today. And before we get started, I do want to clarify that there are a lot of issues surrounding supply chains and multiple topics to cover. But for the purpose of our conversation today, we're going to focus specifically on business operations and access to goods and services.
Very good. The last time I veer off topic a little bit, just bring me back within the rails.
I'll do my best, sir. The last time we spoke, we discussed the pandemic, how it exposed weaknesses in our supply chain. And a few weeks ago, President Biden signed an executive order calling for a review of supply chains in an effort to avoid future shortages on goods that were critical throughout the pandemic.
That's correct. In fact, the executive order directs 2 reviews. The first is a quick look. That task is to be completed within 100 days, and it's a review to identify supply chain risks. And then the second, more comprehensive review requires that the agencies and departments that were tasked develop reports at the end of 1 year, and then those reports will be collated and presented to the president. And these reviews, frankly, concern more than just the pandemic. They touch on national security as well as economic recovery. In part, the executive order states that the United States needs resilient, diverse, and secure supply chains to ensure our economic prosperity and national security.
I see. I'd like to start with your interpretation of this executive order. Based on your experiences as a military procurement official, what is the administration trying to accomplish, and is this the right approach?
Yeah, so let me lay out just a little bit. Previously, we talked about how the pandemic exposed several weaknesses in the supply chain for critical items that were related to the pandemic. Things like personal protective equipment, pharmaceuticals, medical precursors, ventilators, and others. And all of those, to a varying degree, are maintained in a national stockpile. But there was not nearly enough to deal with the tremendous demand caused by the pandemic. And then beyond the pandemic, other factors impacted supply chains. Recent severe weather in the Southwest, last year's trade disputes with China, the European Union, and others as well as, surprisingly, the availability of shipping containers. So the uneven global recovery over the last year exposed some vulnerabilities beyond those things we talked about previously, and aren't directly related to the pandemic. Things like integrated circuits, which are also called semiconductors, chips, sometimes microprocessors, shipping containers, plastics, specialty chemicals that rely on the oil and gas industry, which was impacted by the severe weather in the Southwest, wood products. There's plenty of raw material, just not enough capacity at the mills. So all those things are also in the news. Talking specifically about chips, the Samsung CEO recently discussed the worldwide imbalance between supply and demand for chips. We've seen shortages in the auto industry, but he suggested it will adversely affect business operations worldwide, and indicated that Samsung may actually skip the rollout of its next generation Galaxy phone. So I think the president is attempting to take a whole of government look at supply chains and make sure that what we have are both secure and diverse. And they'll have those when they possess the following attributes. They can facilitate domestic production. They contain a range of supply. They include built-in redundancies. They maintain adequate stockpiles. They use safe and secure networks, and they support world-class American manufacturing and workforce. All those things are worthwhile goals. So yes, I think this is a good first step, and for several reasons. It builds on previous work done by the Department of Defense to respond to two executive orders, one in September of 2019 to address the threat of domestic supply chain resilience or reliance on critical minerals from foreign adversaries and supporting domestic mining and processing, as well as one from July of 2017 to assess and strengthen the manufacturing and defense industrial base and supply chain resiliency of the United States. And additionally, annually, DoD provides industrial capability reports to Congress. But all of these reviews are only going to help if they develop real, actionable recommendations that the nation, read the administration, Congress, and industry and the private sector, are willing to implement.
Yes, sir. Yes, I'm nodding along. I completely understand. I will say, an administration official was recently quoted as saying that the reviews will be modeled after the process the Department of Defense uses to regularly evaluate and strengthen the defense industrial base. As someone with a monumental experience on military supply chains and their processes, what are your thoughts on the administration modeling their review in the same way?
Well, I think the process used by DoD provides a solid starting point, since the Department of Defense serves as the national stockpile manager and completes the reviews that we discussed in the last question for those two executive orders, as well as their annual reports to Congress. The real challenge, though, is demonstrating the will to follow through and then take action to solve the problems that the review will expose. The reports we discussed above suggest that DoD and others identify lots of problems. They don't always do as well resolving the problems, and so our challenge is really to attack them once they're identified.
I understand. So following up on that, if risks, challenges, or problems are identified after the review or during the review, what do you believe would be some next steps? And do you think the administration will apply pressure on corporations to move suppliers back to the United States? And just to second that, if they do, how would they apply such pressure? You think it'll be incentives, tax breaks, regulations in some cases?
Sure. The EO, just in its opening paragraphs, identifies some problem areas. Semiconductor manufacturing that we've already mentioned, high capacity batteries, critical minerals, which includes rare earths, PPE and pharmaceutical agreements. So the review and reports will certainly identify others. The next step then will be to parse the recommendations that are due at the end of the year and determine who can act on those recommendations and what actions to take. Will it be policy that can come from the administration? Is it legislation that has to come from Congress on the Hill? Or is it industrial capacity that the private sector can influence? In Section 5 of the EO, which requires agency heads to report on actions they take during the year, maybe that will generate some movement on these issues. The section also establishes a quadrennial cycle to repeat these reviews. And then it directs that the reports identify federal incentives and amendments to federal procurement regulations to attract and retain investments, either domestic or foreign, for these critical goods and materials. The EO mentions a couple of times using incentives and inducements, so carrots, if you will, rather than sticks. Currently the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR, provides ways to incentivize industry, particularly small businesses. Companies like Native Alaska corporations or American Native corporations, Native Hawaiian corporations, women-owned small businesses, veteran-owned small businesses, disabled veteran-owned small businesses, those that are in hub zones, historically underutilized business zones, or 8As, so small disadvantaged businesses, have a set of inducements that exist within the Small Business Administration. And in some cases, contracts can be awarded to those entities sole source, so without competition, for up to $100 million based on the National Defense Authorization Act of a couple years ago. But there's also opportunities to employ non-federal acquisition regulation-based contracting, like other transaction authorities. For example, Naval Surface Warfare Center Indian Head in Maryland recently asked the National Armaments Consortium to help them work with industry, education, and other consortium members to develop advanced energetics. So those are the things that propel bullets, rockets, missiles, and then make them go boom when they get to the target. You suggested, and Congress can, offer tax incentives at the federal level. But states and municipalities can do the same thing to attract manufacturing into their jurisdictions. And if necessary, there are some sticks available. The President and the Congress can require production in the U.S. by amending laws that already exist, like the Buy American Act and the Berry Amendment, or they could create new other protectionist legislation to demand production here in the United States.
I see. And, when I worked with you at Systems Command, we did work closely with our NATO allies on weapons system procurement, and a lot of those relationships were critical. If the administration does direct firms to relocate suppliers, do you think we risk angering our allies in the European Union, Canada and Mexico?
I don't think so, because in more than one place, the executive order mentions coordinating with allies, partners, and like-minded nations. So perhaps this can lead to additional multilateral and bilateral trade agreements with the U.S. and our trading partners. And depending on the specific industry and its need for access to either raw materials or inexpensive labor, one could make a case for putting a manufacturing facility either in Canada or in Mexico, and that would strengthen the ties between our three nations. As you know, the previous administration updated NAFTA by negotiating USMCA and then getting it ratified. So that provides a solid framework for trade within North America. And transportation between those three nations is excellent and may even get better with the proposed acquisition of Kansas City Southern Railroad by Canada Pacific, which was announced over the weekend. That would create the first rail system that directly connects Canada, the US, and Mexico.
I see. Previously, you mentioned under the Trump administration, they did use the Defense Production Act 18 times to aid vaccine development. The Biden administration has invoked the Defense Production Act recently to increase vaccine supply and delivery of doses earlier than expected. In your opinion, was this necessary, and could there be any ripple effects?
I believe invoking the Korean War era DPA to increase vaccine supply was absolutely necessary, appropriate, and important. As a nation, we need to rapidly inoculate our population and then support worldwide vaccinations. And so if we have increased industrial capacity that can produce those vaccines, that's a good thing. As researchers continue to discover new COVID variants, some more easily spread and potentially more fatal, I think it's vital to vaccinate as quickly as possible and reduce the spread. I don't see any specific ripple effects from this use of DPA. If anything, it will add revenue to additional companies in the pharma industry sector, which will strengthen them. For example, Merck, who will team with J&J to increase production of their vaccine, stands to receive $268.8 million from the government to both increase their capacity by providing fill and finish services, as well as to procure additional equipment. Generally, the pandemic alerted the government and industry to problems in the medical supply chain. Drug shortages, concentrated production of precursors are part of a larger discussion about reliance on offshore production. So I suspect this was part of the impetus for the executive order. My concern is that when the only tool in the toolbox is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So while DPA is useful, we need to develop additional tools and do a better job of understanding tools that we already have and how best to employ them. As a nation, it would help if we became more proactive. Perhaps the review and reports can aid in that, but since DoD already does this every year and we still have problems, unfortunately, the likelihood is we will remain reactive.
I see. When it comes to critical goods, you did mention earlier semiconductors and chips, and certainly I think those are at the top of the list, right after medical equipment. The governments of South Korea, China, and Singapore invest billions of dollars a year in their semiconductor industries. And as we stand today, the United States has limited federal investment in semiconductors. How will the executive order help determine if such investments are needed to improve the prospects for the United States in the long term?
Well, to your list of countries, I would add Taiwan. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is one of the largest producers of chips worldwide. And that has its own set of problems vis-a-vis Taiwan's relationship with mainland China and the Chinese Communist Party's stated goal to reunify that wayward province, in their words. And so while the federal government has not previously made significant investment in semiconductors, U.S. industry does invest heavily in chips, though most of their investment is in the design of those chips, not the manufacturing. Almost all U.S. tech companies design their own chips and then outsource production. That may change. As we discussed before we began, Intel recently announced a $20 billion investment to increase production here in the U.S. And I suspect the reviews will recommend increased investment in domestic production. I would also note that DARPA recently announced a partnership with Intel and 3 universities, Florida, Maryland, and Texas A&M, to design and automate processes that eventually will boost the production of secure chips, those that are used in defense systems. The Biden administration has also committed to spend $37 billion to speed U.S. production of chips. I think most of your clients will recognize that the need for chips is going to continue to grow as the number of smart and connected devices continues to explode. Internet of Things. So for many reasons, not the least of which is ensuring access to production capacity, we should manufacture some of those chips in the United States.
I completely agree with you. Your comment about what the president of Samsung said earlier, was very, very impressive. That the pandemic is having such an impact, not just only on the United States, but it is having an impact across the world in the supply chain. And in addition to semiconductors and chips, our defense industry relies on the use of rare earth elements. And in recent years, China dominated this market, producing approximately 90% of the world's rare earth metals in 2019. The U.S. depends on China for approximately 80% of our rare earth metal consumption. And last fall, former President Trump declared that our dependence on China for critical minerals was a national emergency. What do these shortages mean in terms of national security, and what are some of the risks of depending on China for these critical supply chain raw materials?
Well, it means a great deal for national security because these things are part of our weapon systems. They're part of all of the things that we all rely on every single day. The good news is that these rare earth elements exist in many places throughout the world, though a general overview, one wouldn't immediately grasp that, including here in the United States. But most domestic mines and processors are not currently producing. Some time ago, 60 Minutes even did a story on rare earth mines out west. China dominates the market because they employed some predatory practices to take control of the market. They are unhampered by safety and environmental regulations like we are in the U.S., like much of the developed world is, and they have access to plentiful, inexpensive labor. Initially, they flooded the market with these rare earths, which drove down the prices and forced U.S. mines and U.S. processors to either shutter or go bankrupt. Then they artificially limited the supply, which drove the price back up. But the damage had already been done to other producers, so they did not re-enter the market. At times, China has even held the U.S. and other countries hostage in order to gain policy concessions demanded by the Chinese Communist Party, before they allowed access to those materials. So I believe the Trump administration correctly identified the problem. We need these elements for our weapon systems and for nearly every technology device that you and I and your clients rely on in everyday life, as well as for the growing electric vehicle sector. So it is appropriate for the government to induce the private sector to develop cost-effective and safe ways to both mine and then process these materials in the United States. But it's also good for our government to invest in third world countries that have known deposits of these rare earth minerals to counter what the Chinese are doing with their Belt and Road Initiative that seeks to further corner the market on these materials. Because if we don't do that, we will not be able to maintain free access to these elements.
I see. You know, we've spoken a lot about the executive order and reviews, things that can be done in policy, legislation, but in the here and now, the current shortages that you've described in terms of the shipping containers and chips are expected to continue, almost throughout the year. In your opinion, what can be done to help supply chain issues right now in the short term?
Sure. So, I mean, in the short term, we need to prioritize our consumption so that those things that we need the most, we produce and then consume. And then where possible, we increase production where we already have the capability to produce, either by adding additional shifts, which would have the secondary effect of reducing unemployment, or using overtime so that they can maximize the output of current employees. In the longer term, the private sector can't wait for the federal government to tell them what to do. They know, if they have insight into their supply chains, where they have shortages. And those create opportunities for investment, for teaming, and for innovation. The government will likely incentivize domestic production or allied/partner nation production for some commodities, particularly those that impact national security and our way of life. And this needs to be a team sport. You know, in the defense industry, it's not uncommon for companies that normally compete with each other to team for specific opportunities, competimates, if you will. When viewed through individual industry lenses, rather than by individual companies, perhaps opportunities exist for them to come together in team to mitigate some of the shortages. And then, much like the national stockpile provides some buffer against increased demand and short-term shortages, each industry and each company within industry sectors will need to decide for themselves how much inventory should they keep on hand versus how much they rely on just-in-time delivery. I got it, inventory costs money, but not producing and having to furlough staff also comes with costs. So it's a multivariable problem, but well within the ability of the public and private sector to solve. But as we kind of touched on earlier, we need to demonstrate the will to solve some of these, even if it means sacrificing some short-term profits for longer-term stability.
Now, I've been nodding along as you've been going through this, General Brogan. And as we close out, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to add on what we just covered?
Well, as both your questions and my responses suggest, almost every discussion about supply chains touches on China. Between the trade policies of the last administration, the initial stance taken by the current administration, the actions of China in the South China Sea and with respect to their neighbors in the Indo-Pacific, and many other examples, clearly the relations between our governments are strained. And while we're going to remain competitors, we don't need to become enemies. So keeping the relationship between these two largest economies in the world from either devolving into a Cold War or, much worse, breaking into a shooting war will remain a challenge for this and for future administrations.
Thank you, sir. I think that was extremely well said. And with that, I'd like to just thank you for your time and your valuable insight. And on behalf of the team here at AmeriVet Securities, we really appreciate you joining us today for this conversation.
Well, Jason, I appreciate the opportunity.
Great, sir. I look forward to the next one. So until then, please take care and stay safe.
You as well.